Radio Algeria International, our voice in the world.
This is the English service of Radio Algeria International. It's time for the news.
In today's top stories, Algeria commemorates the 64th anniversary of the demonstrations of the 11th December 1960, a commemoration that highlights a highly significant stage in terms of loyalty and devotion to the homeland, as stated by the Algerian president in his message on the occasion to the people. Algeria strongly condemns the violation by the Zionist entity's army of Syria's sovereignty and the aggression against her territories after having taken control of the occupied Golan buffer zone. The UN humanitarian coordinator for Gaza has informed the members of the Security Council of the feeling of abandonment of the Palestinians in this territory who live in inhuman conditions in the absence of a political will to improve aid. Hello and welcome to Radio Algeria International. I'm Jamal Semeni. Algeria commemorates today the 64th anniversary of the demonstrations of the 11th of December 1960, when the Algerian people took to the streets in massive demonstrations in several towns across the country to loudly demand Algeria's independence and put an end to the myth of French Algeria. The resounding cry of the Algerian people 64 years ago, which echoes to this day, put the final nail to the coffin of the French colonial project, which aimed to uproot the Algerian people, erase their history, and alter their social makeup. However, the wisdom of the Algerian Revolution and the rallying of the Algerian people around it revealed to the world the true face of the French colonial oppression. You will know more in our special program broadcast at the end of our news bulletin. On this occasion, the President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, has reaffirmed that the Algerian people, proud of their sacred legacy of cohesion and defense of national unity, remain faithful to the eternal message of the martyrs. Asia Bika has more.
In his message on the occasion of the 64th anniversary of the demonstrations of December 11, 1960, the president said Algerian people laid the foundations of a state strong by its institutions and economic capacities and protected by its army. He added that Algeria is fully aware of the current regional challenges. He said the demonstrations of December 11, 1962 came amid terrible historical circumstances and were a cry for freedom and dignity and a call for justice in the face of tyranny and colonial domination. The president said Algerians took to the streets on December 11th and demonstrated as one man, expressing their full and complete adherence to the glorious revolution and their attachment to the objectives outlined by the declaration of November 1st. The President of the Republic also stressed that the valiant Algerian people, thanks to their national awareness, preserved their homeland from conspiracies and desperate attempts to crush the spirit of patriots. The president added that thanks to the people's awareness, the state is moving forward with the completion of the national project of a global and sustainable development launched as part of the new Algeria.
President Abdelmajid Tebboune has held talks in Nouakchott with his counterpart from the Republic of Senegal, Bassirou Diomaye Faye. The talks took place on the sidelines of the President of the Republic's participation in the Continental Conference on Education, Youth and Employability, held in the capital of Mauritania. As you followed in our top stories, Algeria has strongly condemned the violation by the army of the Zionist entity of Syria's sovereignty and the aggression against its territories after having taken control of the buffer zone of the occupied Golan Heights and the announcement of the cancellation of the disengagement agreement signed in 1974, taking advantage of the current circumstances in Syria and the instability in the region to improve a new fait accompli in line with the expansionist and colonial policy of the Zionist occupation authorities. A statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that Algeria also denounced the repeated attacks by the Zionist occupation army, which have been on the increase recently against Syrian institutions. The same source added that while reaffirming its unchanging position in favor of Syria's unity and territorial integrity, as well as its legitimate right to recover the occupied Golan Heights in line with the laws and international conventions in force, Algeria calls on the international community to adopt a unified position guaranteeing Syria's security, stability, and territorial integrity. The spokesman for the UN Secretary-General, Stéphane Dujarric, has said that the United Nations opposes any violation of Syria's territorial integrity after the Zionist occupation army seized a buffer zone in the Golan Heights in southwest Syria. Asked about media reports that Zionist occupying forces had recently carried out a number of attacks against Syrian infrastructure and institutions, Stéphane Dujarric said that at a daily press briefing that the UN is against this type of attack.
We continue to consider the Golan Heights occupied territory. I think we were very clear about the violation of the disengagement agreement following the IDF occupation of the buffer zone. So, I think our reaction was very clear yesterday and remains the same today. I think, first of all, Mr. Pedersen addressed that this morning. It is very clear that we stand against any violation of the territorial integrity of Syria. We are against these types of attacks. I think this is a turning point for Syria. It should not be used by its neighbors to encroach on the territory of Syria. It should be used by all those in the region and beyond to support the Syrian people so they can choose their own path, so they can work on a transition that is Syrian-led, that is Syrian-owned, that is inclusive.
You're still listening to Radio Algeria International. The United Nations General Assembly in its emergency special session is today considering a resolution in support of UNRWA submitted by Jordan, Indonesia, Algeria, Guinea, Qatar, Kuwait, Lebanon, Malaysia, Egypt, and the State of Palestine. The draft resolution affirms the General Assembly's support for the mandate of UNRWA in all its fields of operation, namely Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the occupied Palestinian territories. The draft resolution condemned the legislation adopted by the Zionist Knesset, and the Assembly called on the Zionist government to abide by its international obligations, respect the privileges and immunities of the agency, and fulfill its responsibility towards it. It further called for allowing and facilitating the provision of full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian assistance in all its forms to the entire Gaza Strip. The draft resolution warned against any attempts to dismantle or reduce the agency's operations and mandate, noting that any cessation of suspension of its work would have dire humanitarian consequences for millions of Palestine refugees. The draft resolution stressed the need to provide compensation in line with international law for the losses, damages, and destruction suffered by the agency in the occupied Palestinian territory, calling on the Secretary-General to conduct the necessary assessments to achieve this goal. The UN Humanitarian Coordinator for Gaza, Sigrid Kaag, has transmitted to the members of the UN Security Council the feeling of abandonment of the Palestinians in this territory, who are living in inhuman conditions in the absence of the political will to improve aid. Said Bouhazi reports.
Sigrid Kaag told the press after submitting her regular report to the Council in a closed meeting that she had spoken of the inhuman conditions in which human beings like us civilians, young and old, are living. She said that she had painted a very, very gloomy picture as civilians in Gaza continued to suffer.
I've just briefed the Security Council, as you know, in closed session about the utterly devastating situation in Gaza. I've spoken of the inhumane conditions in which our fellow human beings, civilians, are trying to survive, the young and the old. We've also spoken, of course, of the context and our hope for a ceasefire and the unconditional release of the hostages, that this would enable, obviously, a further surge of assistance. But ultimately, I have painted a very, very bleak picture as civilians in Gaza continue to suffer. And I've mentioned to the Council members that I visited Gaza in the course of my life, different professional roles since the end of the 80s. As a volunteer, I visited as a UN staff member, I visited as a UNICEF regional director, and in 2020 as a minister. But nothing prepares you for what you see, what you hear, and the conversations you're having with your fellow human beings, Palestinians in Gaza.
The scale of this aid is still far from sufficient to deal with the catastrophic situation. The UN keeps repeating, deploring the large number of humanitarian convoys that have been refused by the Zionist entity.
I'm always deeply humbled and struck by the individual dignity. But people also feel abandoned by all of us, and I've said this to the Council. At the end of the day, you'll know it. The ask is, where is the international community? When will there be a ceasefire? You've seen in recent days also in response to the Lebanon ceasefire, Palestinians expressed a worry. Will we be forgotten, or will it our turn be next? So people live between a little bit of hope, to my mind, but I want to be careful to speak on behalf of others, a little bit of hope and ultimate despair. No system can and will substitute or compensate for an absence or lack of political will. This is political will and political choice. This you cannot ask of the UN, of the humanitarians. This is where member states and the parties are at play.
The Dutch diplomat was appointed a year ago at the request of the UN Security Council to coordinate humanitarian aid to Gaza.
UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, has said that life-saving aid to besieged areas in North Gaza Governorate has been largely blocked for the past 66 days. It added that recently about 5,500 people were forcibly displaced from 3 schools in Beit Lahia. The director of the UNRWA office in Gaza, Ines Hamdan, said malnutrition is spreading in Gaza while famine is imminent.
The humanitarian and living conditions for the population in the Gaza Strip are still catastrophic. Malnutrition is spreading while famine is imminent, according to UN reports. Hospitals are overwhelmed by the sick and injured. There is also an increase in cases of malnutrition, in particular children, according to the data we have received. Meanwhile, there exists a serious shortage of food and some basic commodities, mainly flour, due to the imposed obstacles and the lack of subsidies. The magnitude of the suffering experienced by the Gaza Strip remains the same for 14 months now.
An estimated 26,000 Palestinians have suffered life-changing injuries over the past 14 months. Persons with disabilities continue to disproportionately suffer from severe trauma, lack of rehabilitation services, and limited availability of assistive devices. Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, Filippo Lazzarini, has called for increased support for the population of the Gaza Strip and urged all parties to continue to facilitate safe and unhindered humanitarian access to the Palestinian enclave ravaged by over a year of a genocidal Zionist aggression. The head of UNRWA also said that a joint UN convoy was able to deliver aid on Tuesday to nearly 200,000 people in the southern and central regions of Gaza, resuming aid via the Kara Abu Salim crossing. Now to other news. The UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, has issued an alert after a surge in the number of displaced people fleeing war-torn Sudan for neighboring South Sudan. Asya Bikar.
More than 20,000 people crossed into South Sudan last week alone, with the number of daily arrivals tripling compared to previous weeks. This includes South Sudanese refugees who have been living camps in Sudan's White Nile state, where fighting between the Sudanese army and the rapid paramilitary forces is continuing. UNHCR said the majority of those displaced are women and children, as it underscored the impact of the conflict on vulnerable populations. UNHCR spokesperson Olga Sarado said some were leaving due to the direct impact of continuing violence, but others were fearful of how the situation can evolve in the next few days. UNHCR said their teams and partners are on the ground, but the situation is extremely worrying in terms of humanitarian assistance. The UN agency reported people arriving at the main border crossing at Juda, but also at informal crossing points, which are extremely difficult to access. All the new arrivals need life-saving humanitarian support with water and healthcare, the most urgent needs, especially given the ongoing cholera outbreak.
Algeria has ratified the convention signed with Libya and Tunisia to establish a consultation mechanism on shared groundwater in the Northern Sahara. This came in accordance with a presidential decree signed by the President of the Republic last month. It is worth noting that the agreement concerns the setting up of a mechanism headquartered in Algeria in order to allow the three countries to cooperate and consult on the management of shared groundwater in the Northern Sahara, in line with the instructions of the leaders of the three brother countries during the tripartite presidential summit held in April in Tunis. You're still listening to Radio Algeria International.
Once again, violence on the streets of strife.